and people can feel free to have their cameras on or off. I know we're all Zoom lagged in various ways. So I respect the need to withdraw from visibility sometimes. So anyway, Kerry is an assistant, associate right now? No, okay, assistant. Okay, I thought so. Assistant professor of English at UT San Antonio. Her work focuses on Black Atlantic studies, race, slavery, and gender in the long 18th and 19th centuries, on critical race theory, and on Jane Austen, race and empire, and anti-racist and decolonial pedagogies. She's the co-editor of Romanticism, Sincerity, and Authenticity, which came out through Palgrave Macmillan. And she's written a number of really amazing essays that I know like people in Romanticism just take to be pretty foundational works in anti-racist and decolonial studies within Romanticism and 18th century studies. So some of those include BLM 2020, Breathing, Resistance, and the War Against Enslavement, and also The Slave as Cultural Artifact, the case of Mary Prince. So we're really excited to have Kerry here with us. And then Kate is joining us from Mount Holyoke, where they're an associate professor of English and the chair of the Critical Social Thought program. She's the author of Romantic Vagrancy, The Poetics of Gender, Affect, and Radical Speculation, as well as the co-editor of the women's writing special issue, Felicia Hemmons in the Wider World. Kate has also just been like a really amazing force in focusing on pedagogy in Romanticism. So she edits the pedagogy section of the Romantic Circle's online journal. And then last year, she really forcefully petitioned for and got funds from the Keats Shelley Association and Romantic Circles to organize the first ever Anti-Racist Pedagogy Fellows Program. So we're just really grateful and excited to have you guys both with us for this event. And I'll turn it over to you now.
Oh, thank you so much. This feels really nice actually on a Friday. It's like when you're looking at your diary and you just see meetings, but thanks, it's nice to see everybody here, and thanks for coming. And I'll just do a quick outline, and then Kate and I want to say a few words. And really what we've got here is a flexible outline depending on how bouncy you're all feeling, or how, you know, in a listening mode you're feeling, so we can adapt. And I think Kate and I would like to invite you all just to jump in at any point. Hands up. You know, it's a workshop space. It's hard to do that. It's hard to read body language in the Zoom, but we do want it to be interactive. And we'll just keep talking if you don't stop us. So do stop us, do interject, and do share. So we're just going to ask some opening questions, and then Kate's going to run through a passage on Fanon, from Frantz Fanon, as you can see, and then I'm going to try and give it, you know, say some more things, and then do an exercise, a close reading exercise on the novel The Woman of Colour from 1808, which I think some of us, and maybe many of us, are teaching. But we just wanted to open first of all with acknowledging that the fact that, you know, 2 weeks ago, what is time, we decided, and I'm very grateful to Lenora for supporting us in this, to postpone the session. It just wasn't possible to really speak or think in that moment, and it also felt like important to give students and communities who are more directly related by the Kyle Rittenhouse decision time to absorb, if that's possible. And, you know, really that this seems to be an ongoing present. There's no end to these ongoing. So we've had the Oakland shooting this week, and we know it won't stop. We know there'll be something else. We know there are, you know, we can see what's happening with Roe versus Wade. We can, the context in which we're doing this work isn't going to let up and give us space. And that's something we just want to acknowledge. And it raises really, you know, important questions about, I think, what we mean by academic progress, you know, in terms of our pedagogy, because if we can see progress being made outside, if we see more, I don't know what shape it is, it's like waves coming at us, you know, white supremacy is the ocean, not the shark. So we're in it all the time. And that feeling of that state of being in it, and something that Christina Sharp spoke earlier in the week from her own forthcoming book, and she quoted Frank Wilderson, who says that we might all share experiences, but from very different positionalities. And that's really important too. So we aren't even experiencing the same experiences while we're in the same ocean. And attention to those positionalities can be part of our anti-racist praxis. We will all be experiencing these facts of life in different ways. And it does also, when we're thinking of students, then it makes us think about what's this doing to the idea of students and their futures. You know, so much of academia is teleologically organized, and yet linear time is clearly not happening. COVID is not, it's not linear. It's not ending. There's no teleological progress in our timeline anymore under racial capitalism. I think that's becoming increasingly clear to us. And I think what's becoming increasingly clear too is that lives and survivals that have been always the case for Indigenous, Black, Latinx population people, now more of us are susceptible to these violences of racial capitalism. And the academy is not a space where we are immune to these ruptures and violences. And I don't think any of us can say that we're not feeling it. So that raises a whole lot of questions about how we navigate and design courses when the assumption is that we're in teleological progressional time in the academy, and how we can help our students navigate that. So I think, you know, to try and think positively, then more than ever, it's an urgent time to build across and from the bottom up, and make sure that we're not stratifying hierarchies in a time where we're being made to feel that everything is scarcer, time is scarcer, resources are scarcer. This is absolutely the time to have sustaining practices for building communities across these different positionalities. And it's time to keep, you know, even more than ever, to bring the marginalized to the center.
So thank you, Kerry. I think one of the things we wanted to think about was, one of the things that I'll just bring out of Kerry's comments that that we have been talking about is being bold in rethinking the kind of affective media ecology of teaching, that that this space and place and temporality that we're in really demands us to rethink effective relations between each other, between our students, among our students, and that you know, the ways that we have been asked to perform certain kinds of labor and certain kinds of media maybe don't really attain anymore. And so I think one of the things that we might build across is build across different modes of expression, and different ways to think about labor and affect in the classroom. So with that in mind, we're going to turn slightly more concretely to think about what anti-racist pedagogy is. And we wanted to start with a quote from a piece by Tita Chico, a quote to help us think about this. Tita wrote, anti-racism takes a stronger position than diversity. The term suggests not only a stance against racism, but a commitment to making that stance active. In these ways, anti-racism is a content area. What ideas constitute anti-racism? What are its histories, its politics, its aesthetics, its archives? And so at the opening here, we wanted to ask everybody to write a few sentences or words or phrases that seem to you to define or describe what you understand by anti-racist pedagogy. What does it involve? What are its main principles? What does it do? In what areas of your own lives and past experiences might anti-racist pedagogy offer a solution, and why? So we thought we'd give you a few minutes to kind of free associate a little bit. And then I think we wanted to go around and kind of have people who felt comfortable tell us a few things. Oh, thanks. Thanks, Lenora. I was about to, thank you. Lenora helpfully put the piece from the LA Review of Books in the chat that the quote was taken from.
So yeah, if it's a content area, what ideas constitute anti-racism? What are its histories? I think that's really important for us to think about in our periods, long 18th and 19th centuries as well. What are its politics, a word that we're often asked to leave aside? And its aesthetics, a word that's often divorced from the prior word. And really importantly, what are its archives? Might these be different archives? Obviously, there are many thinkers we might be familiar with, Saidiya Hartman, Marissa Fuentes, who have something to say about archives, Indigenous writers and material culture. Please share any thoughts you have at this point at the outset.
Should we share now, or did you want to stick
Yes.
to? Oh, okay, gotcha. I wasn't
People
sure
can
if
keep
you're
writing.
writing or. Oh, okay.
People can keep writing, and people can talk gently as others are writing.
I'm so happy to be in the student position right now. I have to tell you, like, it's so nice. Yeah, when I read the question on the sheet that you guys sent out, I like immediately thought of this Sarah Salih piece on Mary Prince that I was just like found to be so helpful in teaching that text and other texts too, because of the ways that she just like really rigorously pushes against the founding of a national or even a homogenous identity for Mary Prince. And I don't know, it just echoes with a lot of other like work on anti-racist pedagogy that I feel strongly about, which is to both kind of like produce a narrative of historical accuracy, which for her is like one of abolition, without buying into the lure of affirming the citizen position or the nation state subject position, and to understand that like when we're reading, we have to do a lot of work to continuously undermine those positions of fixity. And so I feel like that's the thing that I immediately think of in response to that question.
I think that's so interesting when we reflect on writing curricula. They're often restricted by national boundaries, surveys on BritLit that are defined by period and boundaries. And it's Phyllis Sweetley is another figure who, and Equiano, these clearly these boundaries were not made for these people. And so we have to unmake them.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else?
I guess this is brief and maybe not as fully thought out, but I think in considering what this archive would look like, I would say that it feels like it's one that's necessarily really entangled with a bunch of like various archives, whether that's like a geographical question or a demographic question. It's transnational. And I guess I'm thinking a lot with Lisa Lowe's work as well about sort of intimacies within the archives. And I guess maybe also thinking with Hartman, the idea that I think our approach as scholars for thinking alongside and like immersing ourselves in these archives should also be different. So it's less of a looking for like a singular solution and more of a, I think, understanding that there are going to be various absences that are maybe equally as significant as what's included, and just understanding the various formats that we're seeing all of this.
Yeah, I think also I would include too the temporal as well. I know for my students, that's often like a powerful way to kind of undo certain assumptions or fixities, but also but then it also asks them to always be thinking historically, but just not necessarily linearly. And so, yeah, for me, one of the questions is like, how do we honor or think historically without instantiating a kind of fixed periodicity that becomes like limiting or reinstantiating of certain kinds of racist approaches to text. But I mean, I also love the idea of intimacies within the archives and how sometimes that can be a way to help students move across geographies or across move in ways that are unexpected, and then asks them to kind of articulate what those intimacies are.
Yeah, as you're talking, Kim. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Isaac. Go.
Oh, that just reminded me some of the approaches that I've really appreciated are also ones that, I mean, we've talked geographically, temporally, I think also like intergenerically, as you know, rethinking hierarchies of print and what other possibilities there are as far as performance, or you know, I've even looked at scrapbooking, right? That archives don't have to be within the genres of archives that we have typically looked at in the past. There are many other ways to think through what is creative, productive, what there is to encounter and engage with.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we'll move on quickly, but I just wanted to pick up on what Kate was saying, because it really made me think about how abolitionism itself is such, it's organized and as a sort of pre and post, but it isn't at all. You only have abolition because slavery hasn't ended. You know, so the teleology of progression is actually a lie. And I think this is one of the things I battle with so much in our period, is that it's the abolitionism that gets celebrated. But actually that narrative is only emerging out of it. Abolitionism is part of a slave owning culture. And that breaks that teleology. Julia has her hand up.
You're muted.
Yeah. Okay, figured that out. Thanks. Just in responding to a few of the last points, I have recently been writing about, and also the more recent abolition point, Clarkson's map of the history and rise and progress of the abolition of the slave trade. And what's so neat about that map is it's doing that work of, it's a time chart / map. It's sort of breaking down boundaries all over, including America and Britain. So it's really charting, it's like an early network map, charting networks of influence. And you see Thomas Dillwyn, who's gone, sort of traced, he was a Quaker Pennsylvanian and then emigrated to America, to England. And it's so invested in making these connections right in the period and show how important these connections are to the eventual overthrow of, quote unquote, overthrow from his position in 1808, it looked like it, of the slave trade. So it's kind of a neat emblem of what we've just been talking about. So just, that's a bit of the archive too that breaks down, you know, print, prose, etc.
I think that, you know, this is where abolition is such a wonderful case study, because it absolutely is. It's power from below, as Vincent Brown's new book, Tacky's Revolt, is again, you know, another good illustration. And yeah, as you know, these communities, you know, called the common wind. Okay, so I think this is good that we've got started. This is really like a seminar. But we could obviously just keep talking like this. But Kate has a few exercises to work through us with. We'll move on, but keep jotting stuff down, and especially in the chat for us all.
So I'm just going to make a few comments and then share some excerpts from Frantz Fanon to help us. I mean, as you could tell from some of my other blatherings, that I'm interested in rethinking affective relations, how within anti-racist pedagogy, and how that kind of forces us to do so and how we might do so. So I'm just going to start with a bell hooks quote from her chapter, Theory as Liberatory Practice. So she begins that chapter with these sentences about coming to learning through pain. So she says, I came to theory because I was hurting. The pain within me was so intense that I could not go on living. I came to theory desperate, wanting to comprehend, to grasp what was happening around and within me. Most importantly, I wanted to make the hurt go away. I saw in theory then a location for healing. And I mean, I often give this to my students. If we're doing any theory in class, I give it to them in the beginning, because I feel like my students are often searching for something like this, but they also feel that theory is unaccessible or inaccessible. And then there's a lot of guilt around the privilege of reading or thinking about theory. And, you know, one of the things that's interesting to me is that, or not interesting, but important, that Hooks turns to theory to heal. And I've always wondered how much theory is a metonym for non-human books, for others' experiences, or for others themselves. For all of those have the ability to both cause and heal pain. And that Hooks kind of understands that and still takes the leap into that kind of impossible otherness. And sometimes I feel like pedagogy is that leap into a kind of alienating otherness. As much as I ever know my students or feel like I can crack a joke and they laugh or sympathize with them in any form, for me, the experience of walking into the class is still, a place where pain can be healed, but it also can be caused. And so for me, pedagogy is a form of teaching and learning that at its core circulates affective relations. And if that's true, or at least if it's true for me, then anti-racist pedagogy might be about fielding past affects, past pains, and trying not to create new ones. The humanities classroom, though, has already been structured by various forms of affective oppression, especially if we think about Saidiya Hartman's faux sympathy, where unequal and hierarchical relations are already there. And then there is the expectation that somehow we can overcome them with some form of sympathy. But we can also think of Reconstruction and its legal manipulations, so faux emancipations, and other kind of legal statutes that pretend to see a universal person, but don't really. And I think Equiano is really amazing on this, about the idea of emancipation almost being a parody or a satire. And so sometimes I think about these kind of legal manipulations or legal fakeries, forgeries, as akin to a certain kind of law of the syllabus. And I mean, my students increasingly seem to try and glom onto the kind of written text of the syllabus or an assignment sheet, or like a number of pages or a number of sources. And that's surely how they've been taught to kind of interpret prompts through the secondary education that they've received. But there is this kind of, within this affective ambiguity, they kind of latch onto those kind of neoliberal, like faux legal structures. And so that already, I feel like that already structures the classroom in problematic ways. And then there's also, I think, the last kind of structure of effective oppression I'll mention is critique as shaming. And so this, I think, comes through academia as the reinstantiation of racial hierarchies through white discourse that often shames or ignores or erases or subordinates voices of people of color. But it also happens in the classroom where students self-shame or through their own critique, or they shame each other's and they feel that that is critique. And so how do we have conversations that don't invoke shame in those ways, but kind of either think about shame more in more healing ways or kind of move around it? So two things that I'm interested in talking about is the syllabus as a form of iterative revisiting of non-canonical affects and ontology. So kind of what worlds can we put into being from new assemblages of texts? And this includes kind of, some of the things we were just talking about in terms of boundary crossing. But it also includes what kinds of assignments, and not even assignments, what kinds, like, how do we rethink the work of the class and like what we all do together and that what students do. And honestly, how do we kind of avoid certain kinds of assessment? And I also think it's about a necessary encounter with the archive, and an archive that is both doubly silent, but also hyper narrative on issues of race and gender. And the ways that hyper narrativity is both helpful and also confusing. And so I'm more than happy to talk about concrete ways to design syllabi and like how individual texts are offered, like multiple ways of offering assignments that include creative and public facing options, or building cross-institutional resources, or, ungrading, or any of those techniques. But I'm also really interested in thinking, and this is the second thing I'll offer, is thinking about the classroom as continuing the work done by especially women of color, as a private public space where we do the work to alter our forms of relationality more generally. And, if you think about the way you teach and talk to and interact with and relate to students, it affects how they relate to other students, but also the way they relate to us means that we transform the way we relate to the next group of students. So what forms of engagement do we want to honor? What kinds of evidence and arguments do we support and find place for in our classrooms? Or another way to think about it is, what stories do we allow to be told, and how do we allow them to be told? And what affects and affective relations can we augur? And, this, for me, this is like the ground of teaching. So I want to hear by thinking through some pieces that I've extracted from Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, where he is trying to find ways of fighting the death-bringing affects of having objecthood being forced upon him. And, what's kind of, I don't know if magical is the right word, but here he finds in Langston Hughes a language for affect that tries to take in anger and pain and hate, but also find a kind of deep river of affect underneath that codified and manipulated emotion, a sort of being that merges with itself. So I'm just going to read a few pieces of this, and maybe it will spark something in you that might be helpful to talk about. So he says, for us, the body is not in opposition to what you call the soul. We are in the world, and long live the bond between man and the earth. Moreover, our writers have helped me to convince you that your white civilization lacks a wealth of subtleness and sensitivity. Listen, emotive sensitivity, emotion is as reason is Greek. Water wrinkled by every breeze, souls exposed, beaten by the winds whose fruit often drops before maturity. Yes, in one sense, the Black man today is richer in gifts than in works, but the tree thrusts its roots into the earth. The river runs deep, churning precious specks of gold. And the African-American poet Langston Hughes sings, I have known rivers, ancient dark rivers. My soul has grown deep, like deep rivers. The very nature of the Black man's emotions and sensitivity, moreover, explains his attitude confronted with objects perceived with such an essential voice. It's a need for uninhibitedness, an active attitude of communion, indeed, identification, provided the action. And I'm just going to skip down to later where he says, still regarding consciousness, Black consciousness is immanent in itself. I am not a potentiality of something. I am fully what I am. I do not have to look for the universal. There's no room for probability inside me. My Black consciousness does not claim to be a loss. It is. It merges with itself. So in the anti-racist classroom, I think Fanon asks us to attend to others' affects, and that to do that is to understand the historical structures of shame, pain, fear, and hate, to acknowledge their continued circulation, but perhaps to try and allow students and ourselves to find deep rivers of immanent being, particularly for students of color, that literature attending to those affects might offer. And so I am going to stop talking now and hand it over to Kerry.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was really fascinating, really fascinating. And I just want to say, we can teach Frantz Fanon on 18th and 19th century courses. I feel like the time is here for us to say we can do that. We can teach Aimé Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism on our courses. There's no reason not to put Fanon with Equiano, for example. That's some of the undisciplining we can do. So I want to just think about, in her essay, Playing in the Dark, Toni Morrison describes how, quote, the process of organizing American coherence worked through a distancing Africanism that became the operative mode of new cultural hegemony. And again, what that whole SM book is doing is just drawing our attention to what we accept as normative formations now were made very consciously. And we're already, we're in a moment, I think, where Black Lives Matter 2020 looked like it might unmake a lot of those. And what's so hard about now for our students and for us is that, no, that's not the case. If anything, those structures are being intensified and held on to. And so the visibility of how those dynamics work is no longer just, theoretical. Going back to theory, the whole battle, I'm sitting in a state that has passed SB3. It's now illegal for student teachers to talk about Martin Luther King. I'm teaching MA students who are teachers in Texas high schools and cannot teach this material. So these formations are not theoretical anymore, they're real. And so there's going to be a responsibility for those of us in academia, even if we're clinging by our fingernails in various ways, to recognize that we're part of that formation, and are we going to be part of the reiteration of that formation, or are we going to be part of the unmaking of it? And Morrison appeals to us to not create separate areas, not to segregate, not to, quote, move the gaze of African American studies to a different site. We must find ways to avoid the racist segregations of our society and the ableist segregations and the gender segregations being replicated in our disciplines. And that word, of course, comes from punishment. Its oldest root is a system of rules and regulation, a body of rules. So we might want to think about that and think about abolition and policing, and those relationships between what we're doing in the classroom and what the police state does. Certainly something I've really been thinking of. And I remember when I had just finished my PhD and I got my first lecturing job in Oxford Brookes, and we had to do the sort of, becoming a teacher course. And the education professor said to me, right, well, what are your learning outcomes? And this was when learning outcomes were still quite a new thing in UK academia. And I said, well, I just really want students to think for themselves. And then she said to me, well, how will you know they're thinking for themselves? And I said, that's not my business. And I got disciplined into not thinking that. And I'm now returning to my younger self and saying, I still agree with myself. It's not my job to know what my students know. And that really questions a lot of what we're doing in academia, what we think we're trying to pass on. But really, if there is a real tension between putting people through systems that pass on what are recognized as necessary skills standards. There's a real tension between that and allowing students to think for themselves, or giving them the space to think for themselves. I'm in a HSI, and that's even more true now. And so I just really want to return to that disciplining. And how do we teach that into this space of crisis? Well, hopefully we can create teaching as an area of sustaining, that sustains students in power structures that oppress them. One way we can do it is to emphasize how Black resistance on our romanticism courses went far beyond the radicalism of white romantics. In fact, that they were critiquing notions of white liberty as they were being articulated, and in fact that those notions became separated by the very boundaries that Morrison speaks about. So the Haitian articulation of freedom is very, very different to the Lockean articulation of freedom, but somehow our disciplines have segregated those. Slavery, genocide, and racial capitalism are fundamental to the history of our period, not marginal, not thematic, but the canons. Belinda's toilette and the rape of the lock, the displays, not just beauty, but also the brutality of imperial consumption. Hazel Carby, in her new book, Imperial Intimacies, describes these kinds of connections as a spider web. And she tells her own story. And from her sort of testimonial, her personal story comes, quote, the architecture of a tale that has the tensile strength of a spider's web, just similar to what Julia was describing, spun across the Atlantic. Spinnerets draw threads from archives, histories, and memories. Our syllabi can do that. Our syllabi can think of themselves more as spider webs, maybe, rather than linear sort of lists. And then how do we situate our students? There's a lot of discourse about how our students don't, the 18th century, 19th century, but I think we have to re-articulate what that means for them. They're living in as Saidiya Hartman, they're living in the presence created by the pasts of those. And they are part of that 18th century intellectual community from my point of view. Could this be a new learning outcome? I want a learning outcome. I want my students to think of themselves as part of an 18th and 19th century studies intellectual community. Who would say that that learning outcome has been met? Well, hopefully my students would tell me if they have felt that they were part of that thinking community now. We're familiar with the trope of the talking book in Black Atlantic and African American literature. In his interesting narrative, Olaudah Equiano tells us, quote, "I had a great curiosity to talk to the book. We know this is famous." And he tells us he would put it to his ears in the hopes it would answer me. "I have been very much concerned when I found it remained silent." And similar to what Kate was saying, I wonder how often we, without meaning to, present the book or the text as a closed object that will only speak to the initiated, and also that cannot listen to its reader. Because when you put your ear to something, it's a reciprocal relationship. It's not one way. Equiano did learn how to speak in and through his master's texts. And I'm working on a little piece right now on Audre Lorde. But to skew her words, he picks up the master's sledgehammer. He picks up his Milton and his Bible and his Shakespeare, and he quotes a lot. It's heavy quoting in his narrative. And he takes them and uses them as a sledgehammer to the master's house. In a roundtable for Silver Press in August 2020, Hortense Spillers said she would have liked to argue with Audre Lorde over her essay, "The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House." Spillers emphatically said, "We must use the Master's tools. They are no more the Master's tools than they are mine, and I must specifically go after the Master's tools, house with his tools." And I think it's a dialectic, it's both. We need the extrinsic tools. Black radicalism, Cedric Robinson tells us, is not part of the central radicalism. It is extrinsic, it is outside, it is other. But we also can use the tools we've been given. And so I'm going to skip through and I'm going to look at close reading exercise, because close reading is definitely at the heart of, traditional literary practice. And I've thought of it in so many different ways, but I want us maybe to think about close reading as a praxis of intimacy making, rather than a discipline of, disciplining students into understanding form. Because that's what I have loved as a student, coming to a lot of texts that didn't speak to me, or that alienated me, or that I wanted to feel part of as a woman of colour, as a person who grew up in Trinidad and came and had their education in a very traditional university setting in Trinity College, Dublin. I loved it when I felt I could interact with the text, be it Gawain and the Green Knight, or Wordsworth's Prelude, whatever the text was. I got something out of feeling intimate with the text. So the next thing is really just an exercise, and I'll scoot through it for time, but you can take your time. This is from The Woman of Colour, the book here, and identify with this book on so many levels. But this woman is a transatlantic subject. She's a Black Atlantic subject. Her mother in the novel is an enslaved woman, and her father is her master. And so Olivia, the colour even of her skin is marked in her name. It's crossing the Atlantic back to England as an heiress of her father's plantation fortune. And she arrives in England, in Bristol, and a little boy, George, her cousin's nephew, sits on her knee. And she's brought with her Dido, who is Olivia's servant slave. Again, that's not quite clear. But how could we read this as a moment in the text of Anti-Racist Pedagogy? How does Olivia move George, her student, from assuming racialization as natural to seeing it as a positionality made by power? How does Blackness function as a force of unmaking in the passage? Because I think that's the other thing I really want to emphasize in my teaching. It's like, whiteness did not make abolition. It didn't. It took the credit for it, but it was Blackness that made it. It was indigeneity that made it. What does Olivia mean how does Olivia move George from believing in race as natural to becoming maybe a child abolitionist? And how does identification, going back to Kate's point, identification, disidentification work in this passage? How do George's affinities and sympathies move around here? So Olivia says, do you still dislike my poor Dido, George? She is very dirty, he said again, shaking his head, but then colouring. He said, I mean, very black. And then Mrs. Merton, his mother, said, she is a poor redacted, in a most sneering and contemptuous tone. That goes back to what Kate was talking about, this making of an object. And then Olivia says, but she is one of the most faithful creatures, George, said I, not deigning to answer his mother. And I love her dearly. Do you love her dearly? He said, looking into my face with a very scrutinizing expression. Only think, Grandpapa, only think, Uncle. Miss Fairfield says she loves the redacted dearly. I dare say she has reason to estimate her, said Mr. Merton. Indeed I have, sir, says Olivia, as your grandson shall hear. She was born upon my papa's estate, said I, addressing my attentive little hearer. Her father and her mother were slaves, or as you would call them, servants to him. But these black slaves are no better than horses over here, said George. I do apologise for all the typos that I'm only now seeing, interrupting me. For I heard the coachman telling one of the grooms so in the servants' hall last night. I think this community and how these nouns are circulated is really interesting in the passage. Those black slaves are, by some cruel masters, obliged to work like horses, said I, says Olivia. But God Almighty created them men, equal with their masters, if they had the same advantages and the same blessings of education. But what right have their naughty masters got to make them slave-like horses? For I'm sure they can't like it. I shouldn't like to work like my mammas, coach horses and stand shivering for hours in the wet and cold as they do. And now we see the move from, object, subject to empathy. There will be no end of this conversation if we come to the right and wrong, said I. Said Olivia. Olivia's saying something in there about debate and discourse. It's interesting. It's beginning to wear an interesting form, I think, said Mrs. Merton. George, we shall have your sentiments on the abolition presently. So Mrs. Merton really reminds me right now of the mothers who are trying to ban critical race theory in schools. Miss Fairfield's rather, said Mrs. Merton. So I think in her teaching to transgress, Bell Hooks says, education can be about freedom, but she also talks about the importance of pleasure. We cannot really learn and be passionate in fearful and oppressive structures. Pleasure must play a role. She says, seeing the classroom always as a communal space enhances our likelihood of collective action. Even in that little space, you can see the boundaries. Mrs. Merton's trying to put boundaries up, and Olivia is trying to construct connection. And Bell Hooks says her pedagogical practices have emerged from the mutually illuminating interplay of anti-colonial, critical, and feminist pedagogies that interrogate biases in curricula that reinscribe systems of domination. This is from Teaching to Transgress. And Bell Hooks asserts, the classroom remains the most radical space of possibility in the academy. I celebrate teaching that enables transgressions, a movement against and beyond boundaries. It is a movement which makes education the practice of freedom. So, we can have a little workshop space here now if you want to either just speak directly. What kinds of transgression can you make possible within 18th and 19th century studies? How can you maybe build an engaged classroom where everyone is a participant, joyfully learning towards collective freedom? Anti-racist pedagogy. Mrs. Merton's functioning very structurally there and is policing what's happening in that space. Could you identify what a praxis of anti-racist pedagogy might involve? And you can write out some sentences or think for yourself, but we definitely have time to talk through these questions that are raised, or just your thoughts in relation to the passage. please feel free to share any thoughts at all, or even any questions, or, I don't even know if some of this is making people feel anxious because, there's an ask here, or if it's making you feel that there are possibilities.
No, I was thinking that in terms of like the question of pleasure, something that I think, I don't know, I assume that anyone who tries to think through the difficulty of getting over the fantasy of expertise in the classroom deals with is the pleasure that has also been produced by adhering to and doing well and performing well under a kind of master-student relation. And so there is that other dialectic in teaching as well, whereas like the more as a instructor or teacher you resist sometimes the position of the expert, which and because of my own, like I have a very non-traditional educational background. So like I just can't really inhabit that position particularly well. But I feel like that desire, oftentimes like it's so complicated because students come to us with the desire and the pleasures. I mean, the pleasures of having done well in a hierarchical setting of education, and especially like in a No Child Left Behind scenario where like they can be disoriented by our disavowal of the expert position. And I think that's okay, because I would prefer discomfort over the comfort of like that repetition. But I think figuring out in the context of a literature course how to engage those the tensions of those pleasures is so it's just a daily struggle.
No, absolutely. And I've had pushback here in Texas from students who complained about not being given enough assessment. And they complained about I did one assessment where I said, this is a handed in and it's 100%. And a couple of students didn't like that because then you haven't earned your A, or how can we all be the same? They want the higher, and they're so schooled into that. So it can be very hard unmaking the systems. It isn't always, always going to be celebrated for doing that, but it just really makes legible how these are not just systems, they're how people think and feel about themselves. They want to be measured often.
Yeah, I think maybe figuring out like what I mean, when Kate was talking about the remaking of affects in the classroom, I was just thinking like, oh, how do we have to like remap our own affective relations to doing well as teachers or having students like us in order to kind of like do this work? And then what are the coordinates of figuring out like networks of pleasure that come from falling short of the expectations that students might have from their other previous educational experiences? Who do we find pleasure with in that moment when we're uncomfortable because we're not giving them a kind of banking model of learning?
If we don't disrupt that relationship, we're actually sending a mixed message. If we're saying, oh, look what Mary Prince has to tell us, I'm telling it to people of England, I know the truth. If we don't center dispossession as a site of knowledge, then how are they going to listen? People, Mary Prince wasn't believed in her own time. So, now we can't, we hope we can see how paradoxical it is to say, oh, let's listen to what Mary Prince and Equiano have to tell us, or let's listen to what William Apis has to tell us. And then say, oh, but you have to master all these skills to be able to impart any knowledge, and I must be. It doesn't add up. So there is an ethical call on us to make dispossession a site of knowledge in different ways in our period.
I mean, I guess I would want to say two things. One is that I still think like 18th and 19th century literature has so much to offer us by way of finding other forms than what has been typified by college and university administrations as skills. So, I mean, thinking about Equiano and his kind of adjudication or adaptation of the picaresque into his, travel narrative and the way that kind of ironizes emancipation. I mean, I think that that does give us, I mean, like, who knows how to do things but Equiano, right? But it's not a kind of skills-based, heteronormative kind of labor, like productive labor. And so I feel like the more we can ask students not just to like inhabit those texts as they, I mean, of course, as embodiments or ontologies of dispossession, but then also the ways that they maybe offer alternative ways of being that do include kinds of labor or do include like skills, but in a different rubric, or I don't have the language yet to talk about that. And but still to inhabit what he's doing, I think maybe that, like, for me, that's been one way to kind of ask students to kind of, again, like inhabit that mode of being without necessarily having the language to talk about it because of the ways in which we're so overly written by skills and like neoliberal productivity. But I feel like they can feel that when they read it and they can start to inhabit and talk about it, and know that it's like an important frame that they can go back to like think about their own picaresque ways of being in this like disruptive kind of like we're constantly rebooting from like one violent like trauma to the next. And that can give them something. I mean, the other thing I would say is that I do think, like, what I've noticed is some students like really embrace the kind of chaos and the kind of waves and the kind of affective nebulousness, and that is like inspiring and inspiriting to them. And then there are other people who they just need more, I mean, they need more control in their lives, like not in a bad way, but that they operate, like their operating systems operate totally differently. And so what I've been trying to experiment with are like non-directive ways to be concrete, or to give them like things that they can do that they feel like they're accomplishing something, but the things that they're doing aren't so teleological. So to try and give them like a project, okay, here's the project. Now within the project, you still have to self-determine what you're doing, but here are some of the parameters, or here are 3 different options. Now you write me, you write me the rest of the assignment sheet. And they're like, what? And then, you have to talk them through it a little bit. But so to kind of give them ways to be more concrete, or to set their own boundaries. So if they need that, then they can have access to it, but without having them constantly repeating the model of like the laws come from you or the laws come from externally. It's like, well, okay, you can create your own boundaries or your own projects that have their own guidelines, and that can come from you. And then you can kind of get them to interrogate, well, why did you choose this one? Is that really what you want to do? Or is that what you think like I want you to do?
Yes, and I do just want to recognise that for fixed or non-tenure track faculty, a lot of what we're suggesting here is not possible within our structures, because, just even that negotiation and discussion, if you've got 4 and many students, it's just, it often becomes, yes, I'm sorry, I just need, multiple tests to put them through. So, I mean, we recognise that, but I still think we can still imagine even working within those clunkier systems to keep offering choice. And one really rigid thing that I give them to do that actually leads to a lot of variety is just a very simple thing, but I give them maybe a choice of 3 passages from, I did it with the Woman of Colour and Mary Prince this time, and I said you have a choice of either reading it with Venus in 2 acts or with Hortense Spiller's Mama's Baby, 2 quite different pieces, but you must choose one close reading extra and read it with that, even if it's just a few sentences from the essay. And I was so surprised at how many students were tackling Spillers because they found the 1 or 2 sentences that resonate with them. and they put it in, they did it as a close reading, you know, each student saw very, very different things, and each student, so you can give them quite a rigid framework, actually, but what they can say out of it is what they say out of it. And again, that was 100%. You know, that was you hand in the work, and you, having done the work is doing the work. So that's another way to undiscipline that while being quite rigid. Just giving you that as a sort of, as kids, as a concrete example. So it's not hugely ingenious, but it's just another way of thinking, of giving people, this is your material that you're working with, but what you do with it is up to you.
Sorry.
Thanks. And thank you, Kerry, also for bringing up the fact that we can be pairing with like smaller passages, because I feel like that's something I like frequently have been thinking about this semester, that like I felt really lucky in a lot of our graduate coursework that like stuff was paired, and I'm trying to finagle ways to pair that for undergrads without just adding to the workload. But I guess I'm curious, I guess pulling from what both of y'all have said separately, from Kate, the idea of the non-directive yet concrete, and then from Kerry, the sort of desire to create that 18th and 19th community. I guess I was curious whether y'all would feel comfortable sharing a bit about types of conversations you have with students to structure that type of community at the beginning of the semester. Because I feel like that would be helpful beyond just trying to encourage folks to like speak up and be comfortable. I feel like there's a lot of discussion about like trying to create an open environment that can then kind of hit in a slightly less meaningful way than I think a lot of us are hoping it does. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I mean, I know that's a really important question, and just the doing. I mean, I have a good example, which just happened to go well this semester. I'm teaching a Black Atlantic grad course this semester, and as you know, this is a HSI. I had a very diverse group of students, majority non-white. And some of us are teaching Georges, you know, some of us have classrooms full of George. And so that's really, so I think it's really important to do that. And I'm just going to do this from now on. I opened up our 2-hour class with, I primed them beforehand. I sent them the sort of prompt, which was based on testimonial, which is a genre I've learned from since I moved here, Chicana literature and I gave them the blurb of the course, the Black Atlantic. And I said, I want you to come in and speak with a testimonial to how you see the pasts of the Black Atlantic in your present today. It was a real risk. And they talked for 2 hours, and I honestly, and I'm not just saying this, it was the most valuable class we had all semester. And that class actually led to a lot of what I'm saying right now today. I thought, you know, what are we doing? My students already know. So one of my students was a mature student who was bused into school as part of desegregation. Another of my students had been through the military and had a terrible experience last year. I won't share more than that, around the time of the elections. But other students, you know, issues of bilingualism, you know, issues of housing, and then I have white students who are teachers who are really questioning their positionality and wanting to do a good job, and the anxiety that they feel. So it was yeah, I just think all of them has something really concrete to say. I think this goes back to the not having to worry about coverage so much. It's valuing that as learning, and valuing that as still, you know, it's not coverage in the traditional sense, but everybody really learned, and it really was the glue of that course. Again, that's time intensive, but there are other ways to do it. You can put students into groups. I know if you've got your course of 50 or 60 students there, you can put them into groups and you can get them to share and reflect back. There are other ways to do it.
I would just add to that by saying sometimes it depends on like for me, it depends on the level of the class. And also I feel like you don't, especially at the beginning, you don't always know what will work for a class. So sometimes I feel like I try at a few different moments in the class, and like sometimes it never, I had a class, like I will occasionally have classes where, you know, that creating the community just doesn't quite happen. And so I've been trying to work on like being okay with that. But I think for younger students, like asking them to share some of their personal experience, but also get like slowing down at certain moments and having discussions about terms. I mean, even like racism or anti-racism, or like if I'm doing things about gender and sexuality, just really slowing down and taking time to kind of move through something like a really small piece of text and allowing them to open that up and like move around in it together, I think can be really important. I've also started, either like the first day or sometime in the first few weeks, we like set ground rules for difficult conversations. So like in my queer 18th century class, I mean, there's a lot of triggering material. And so we talk about, okay, like, how do you want to have a conversation about this? What do you want to do when you encounter X, Y, and Z in the text? Like, what do we do when somebody says something that makes you uncomfortable or triggers you? How do you want to deal with that? And then, I tell them like, this is going to happen at some point this semester. And so when it does happen, they're not like, it doesn't automatically close down conversation, but we have some guidelines, and then we have the discussion and the meta discussion. Okay, like this is what happened. Like, how would you have wanted to deal with it differently? Like, what is your ideal learning situation? So I do think like periodically having those meta conversations, and then, as Kerry is saying, I think having, if not frequent moments, but having periodic moments to connect it to either contemporary issues or just contemporary literature. So I feel like almost every class now, there's some piece of contemporary literature in there, whether it's like, I just taught a seminar on shapeshifting. And so like every week, I mean, because we were doing a load of stuff, so I could just throw like a contemporary poem or short story in there. And sometimes that would be more central than like the 19th century text, but sometimes it wouldn't. Or like my queer 18th century class, we ended with Jordi Rosenberg's Confessions of the Fox to give them, I mean, they were talking about their lives like the whole class, because that's my students. But at the end, kind of really having a space to think about, okay, we've just talked about queer temporality. Like, how do we think about these lineages, and like what kinds of historiography and what kinds of literary history do we want to do? And so, like, I think giving them spaces to relate it not just like to their own personal lives, but also to think about methodology and like cross-temporal or cross-geographic or, cross-experience methodology, and to say, like, okay, if you were designing class, or if I asked you to edit this book, like, what would your preface be? Like, how would you think about it? How would you rethink the syllabus? I don't know. That's a little, sorry, I'm getting a little rambly, but yeah, I would say finding different ways to do it for different classes, depending on, what the conversations you think might happen, but also like what, if you like using you're going to run into problems. And so like using those problems as moments to slow down, and then like, hey, let's have a conversation about why you think theory is inaccessible and elitist. And like, is that true? And if that's true, then like, what should we be doing here? So like, like it's almost like waiting for those problem moments to crop up, and like seeing them as like theoretical or like important cruxes to then kind of have those larger conversations, and then like to kind of cement the community through moving through those problems.
Yeah, I think that's really important. The not knowing as a side of learning is really important. And I just think as kids talking, you can hear already that these skills that are all being built in alternative ways are incredibly important, actually. They're skills that are based on radical doubt, on skepticism. They're skills that are based on critical thinking, on discussion as actual discussion, community-based discussion. They're just a different shape. And I still think we could also keep the word appreciation in there, which is quite an old school word that I like to keep, because I like the individuality of it. Is that, you might appreciate something, that passage from the woman of color, in a very different way to, I see things that maybe a Black student or a white male student will see it very, very differently. So I like the freedom of appreciation, but it just, again, reminds us that we're not, I think a lot of worry and anxiety about these approaches is that we're losing so much, but we're not abolition is never about just abolishing, it's about putting new stuff in place, or allowing things that have been disallowed back into the space, as Morrison would say. You know, it's not a burning to the ground with nothing going on instead. We don't want to keep you all too much, but if anybody has final thoughts that they'd like to share, please do. And you know, it's been really nice to have this kind of informal chat. But please share anything. There's, you know, time.
I was just going to second Kate's use of Rosenberg's novel. Like, I've used it for the past couple of years in my lit survey class. So we always read it in the middle, and it's reflecting like a speculative trans fiction based on Jack Shepherd, an 18th century character. And students love it so much, and they get so much out of the rethinking, reimagining, and really like re-archiving of what the 18th century was, but has not been like represented as. And just on these like kind of trans-temporal points, I was just thinking like it's so important to bring our periods into the present, so that we're also helping students to think through things like, I mean, I've been trying to figure out for at least the last year now, like how to situate Palestine in 18th, 19th century curricula, because of its incredibly pressing contemporary importance. And yet within our fields, it's totally inadmissible because Palestine as its nation didn't exist in the Romantic period. So I just feel like bringing these contemporary questions into the past also really, you know, kind of dynamizes how we approach our thinking of Romanticism in the 18th century as well, that it like challenges us to like reconsider those national boundaries that we were talking about at the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the 18th and 19th century are not in the glass case for us to look at. You know, I think, you know, seeing them as part of our living presence, our ongoing presence, is so important, and that can bring students right up to it. You know, yeah.
Yeah, Brett.
I'll jump into it. Great. This has been really provocative. Thank you, guys. Just to share a little bit of a thing that I've had more success with this semester than I expected. I've been teaching. I recently took over an early American class. I'm not an early Americanist by training, but nobody was teaching it, and I'm at William and Mary, which is an early American sort of hotbed for a bunch of different reasons. But always teaching the literature, and so especially in that class where I think that my students in that class are livelier than they are, and when I do, you know, Rise the Novel classes in the British tradition, I think it's because they're mostly American students who are thinking about American history and American culture and why it has the shape that it does. And so one of the things that I think has been has opened up what might otherwise be a block for them, I think, is almost to invert maybe some of the premises for what brought this workshop together, which is to sort of say, what if we look for the moments of anti-racism in the texts, right? So that way nobody feels like our function in the classroom is to say that everything that we read is racist and we're better than that. Right. I think that when I've kind of pushed too hard in that direction, students, you know, they get very excited, but I think then the work that they do and the work that they write is kind of, you know, not outstanding, because they're kind of, everybody's patting themselves on the back and telling me things that I already want to hear. But that this other kind of question about, you know, how is, I was just teaching earlier Catherine Mariah Sedgwick's Hope Leslie, like how is Sedgwick trying to imagine a kind of a set of Puritans who are struggling with the impact of racism and racialization, right? Like it's an unusual question, but I think that they like feeling like, or being exposed to the fact that there are old texts, and this is just something that Kerry and Kate were both saying before, that there are plenty of old texts where the writers, or if not the writers, the characters they create are trying to be allies and trying to be anti-racist, and it's not just that we are the ones who got better and all the texts are benighted and that we're going to all tear them down together, which I find that, you know, it becomes a dog pile in class whenever I've gone too far in that direction. But this other type of thing, looking for attempts at allyship, looking for botched attempts at allyship, so we can all kind of, you know, gently see ourselves in those. and you know, that to me, that's a slightly different pedagogical proposition than I had tried before, and it's emerging from, I think, the fact that I shifted into a new area that I hadn't really covered before. But as a thing to share with everybody else, you may have been doing this as second nature. It was not second nature to me, but the sort of, you know, looking for the moments in the texts that register that people back then were working on the same problems we're working at, and they were having a hard time with it too, and sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't work, that this brought us all together in a different conversation than the, you know, is Jonathan Swift a misogynist, yes or no kind of discussions that I was getting bogged down in every time I brought it up in British literature class. So it could be the freshness of the material, it could be that it's American and my students are American, or what was going on. But I think that instead of, part of anti-racist pedagogy for me has been finding anti-racism in the texts and then bringing that out, rather than to find racism in the text and call it out.
I think that's a really important point. I mean, I think Austen's really useful in that regard too.
Mhm.
She's offering a satire on how whiteness is making itself in many of her novels. And I also think it's part of why Pamela taught remarkably well when I was doing the old style Brit Lit service here, because I think students were genuinely amazed that a man had written so sympathetically on behalf of a 15-year-old girl who was facing a lot of the kind of harassments that a lot of my students who work in the service industries face on a daily basis. So I absolutely think you're right. Is that I think that, you know, definitely, you know, that we're not part of some woke culture new gang. It's just that you know, dominant structures were put in place to block these voices, and it goes back to what Julia was saying about networks and collaborations. No, that's really important part of the conversation, I think. Well, I think it's Friday afternoon, and I mean, we can obviously yeah, carry on talking for a long time, but probably setting me all free is a good idea. But I'm very grateful for everybody to think together. And it doesn't come as second nature. That's by any means. All of this is, yeah, I hope you can see how, you know, it's tentative and also speculative, a lot of it, and aspirational and in the making.
Thank you so much. It's really wonderful. Oh, you know what? I forgot to announce at the beginning, which I should, that our last event will probably also be of interest to people. So we're going to be having Christine Yao and Keela Wazana Tompkins. They're going to be talking about Christine's new book, Disaffected: The Cultural Politics of Unfeeling in 19th Century America. So we're really excited to have that event. It's just a week from today because we've had a bunch of rescheduling shakeups. So that'll be next Friday at 12 p.m. EST. So let us know if you're interested in attending that, and hope to see you there. But thanks to Kerry and Kate so much.
Thanks to Lenore and Corey and Isaac for organizing. It was really nice to have this space to talk.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thank you.
Yeah, have a good Friday, everyone.
Seriously, thank you.
Bye, thanks.